And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Starting out with tonight's weather map. Front out here, windy, wet conditions there, central Aleutians, warm front pushing snow and blowing snow. Bristol Bay right on up the west coast here with light snow pushing into the southern Chukchi Sea there. And to the east, another clear, cold night here from the Arctic coast right on down into the interior again. And still some gusty winds through the passes of the mountainous terrain here, especially over the Copper River Basin and the North Gulf Coast. But coming down, places like Resurrection Bay, definitely becoming much lighter for Kodiak Island. Increasing clouds here, pushing up into the Kuskokwim Valley to the western Arctic coast. And over the Panhandle, all this snow shower activity shifting off to the southeast as the low center pulls down to near Vancouver Island. North to northeast winds on the increase as Arctic air starts to blast in from Canada. That continues through tomorrow. You can see a lot of lines here, much drier, skies clearing, temperatures falling, especially up here to the north. But still a risk of some snow shower activity down toward Dixon entrance area, but should mostly all be south of the Panhandle there by tomorrow or tomorrow afternoon at the latest. Up here to the north, high pressure holding, keeping this storminess way out there to the west, but aloft there's a flow from a westerly flow here, pulling moisture with this warm front, trying to push it in at least to the northern Kuskokwim Valley areas, but not a whole lot out here. Still some light snow up across the Seward Peninsula, southern areas to the Bering Strait, and then cutting off to the south there with mild southerly winds coming up, and then along the main front out here to the west stays wet over Adak and Atka, drying out again towards Shemya. And then for Saturday, a stronger system develops here over the far western Bering Sea, actually down toward Shemya or so with the front right through here. More gale force winds and some rain into the central Aleutians. Still looking at mild south to north flow here in the Bering Sea. And a weak warm front, maybe some light snow there for the southern Seward Peninsula, southern slopes of the western Brooks Range, and maybe the Arctic coast, but nothing heavy. Some of this moisture in the form of some light snow slides in over the Tanana Valley on Saturday. Definitely lower flying conditions and cloudier skies, and some of that slipping up to the Brooks Range, but very strong high pressure here over the Yukon. Keeps cold air pouring down in across the southeast coast. Windiest up here to the north, but dry all the way down into Dixon entrance now. Coastal water forecast looking at northerly gales for the south coast tomorrow at 35 to 40 knots, and north to northeast winds 30 to 40 knots for the north coast. And here for Lynn Canal, north winds 40 knots, gusting 55 knots. Good gales for Stevens Passage as well, north at 40 knots, northwest 30 knot winds for Clarence Strait. And then for Saturday, not much change, maybe a little lighter, but not much. Still looking at gale force northerlies here for Stevens Passage and Lynn Canal with gusts of 55 knots there in the canal. And here for the south coast, northeast winds 30 to 40 knots. The north coast, northeast winds 20 to 35 knots. Prince William Sound, north winds 25 knots. And for the western central North Gulf Coast, north winds 25 knots. Blowing out of the Copper River Delta, look for north winds sustained at 40 with gusts to 60 knots for the day Friday. Cook Inlet, much lighter by comparison. Northeast 10 to 20 knots, north at 20 for Kamishak Bay, and northwest 25 for the Barren Islands. And then for Saturday, northwest 25 knot winds continue for the Barren Islands, southern Cook Inlet, Kamishak Bay, north at about 20. A light northeast breeze now, 10 knots for northern Cook Inlet. Light variable winds for the western North Gulf Coast here, and north at 15 for Prince William Sound, and still looking at a northeast wind at 30 knots there for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Kodiak Island tomorrow, lighter winds that'll actually move in tonight and continue through tomorrow. West-northwest at about 15 knots, south-southwest at 20 knots for the Alaska Peninsula, and 15 knots from the southwest for Bristol Bay. Light variable winds for Bristol Bay on Saturday. Same thing for Shelikof Strait, east side of Kodiak, northwest 15. South to southeast winds 15 to 25 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. And for the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, south winds 25 to 35 knots. Gales here for Adak and Atka, south at 40 knots. And for the western Aleutians, looking at south to southeast winds at 25 to 30 knots. And then for the day on Saturday here, with that next stronger storm coming in the front, definitely gale force winds here for Adak, Atka, Amchitka Island, east to Shemya, anywhere from 35 to 45 knots from the east and southeast. Windy also for the Fox Islands. Gale warnings out there too for southeast winds 30 to 40 knots. And for the southwest coast for Friday, south winds 20 knots here for the entire coastline there, southeast at 20 for St. Lawrence Island. And, excuse me, east winds 30 knots for Norton Sound. Excuse me again, south winds at 30 for the Pribilofs and St. Matthew Island. And then for the day Saturday, southeast winds 30 knots, St. Matthew Island, St. Paul, St. George, southeast 20 knots along the southwest coast, and for Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island, winds south at 20 knots. For the Chukchi Sea tomorrow, brisk wind advisories, east 25 to 30 knots, and for the western and central Arctic coast, looking at east winds at 15 to 25 knots, west winds 15 to 25 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast. And then on Saturday, east winds return here to the east side there at 20 knots. Brisk wind advisories here for the central and western coast at 25 knots, and also brisk wind advisories for the Chukchi Sea for south to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots.